you get a war and all of a sudden it's patriotism. Well, the government is able to use that to do all sorts of very unpatriotic things, and they're able to get away with it because, it's a war. And so one of the things that happened in a war is they amended the Federal Reserve Act to enable the Federal Reserve to buy U.S. Treasuries. They weren't allowed to do it before. Why? Because the government wanted to finance the war. And that made it easier. Now, another thing that just happened, right, it was that the Congress, unfortunately, voted to suspend the debt ceiling. They used to raise the debt ceiling. Now they just eliminate it for a period of time, right? They don't even have the integrity to raise it because they're embarrassed about putting a new number, right? So they just suspend it every once in a while so they don't have to be accused of raising it, right? Instead of, voting, to leave it where it is. But the reason we even have a debt ceiling in the first place is because when the Federal Reserve Act was amended, in order to enable the government to borrow from the Fed and the Fed to buy treasuries, Congress was worried that this relationship could result in too much debt, that the government would take advantage of this, and so they passed a debt ceiling. They said, okay, we're going to make a ceiling here and say, look, this is the most debt we're going to allow. That was part of the whole process. Well, obviously it didn't work. The ceiling should have been a constitutional amendment or something. It should have been, a ceiling that could never go up. But unfortunately, that ceiling has been raised every time it's been approached, until just recently when it's just been suspended. But because of the Federal Reserve, the government is enormous. The government never could have grown to the size that it is if it had to pay for its activities with real money. If it actually had to tax the citizens for all of the spending, the citizens would have objected to the spending. People want something for nothing. They don't want something if they have to pay for it. Right? But the government was able to promise something for nothing. But all this is from the Fed. And I think because of the Fed, the United States today is on the verge of the biggest economic catastrophe in the history of the country. And, if you thought the 2008 financial crisis was bad, that's nothing compared to what's coming. That was just the warm-up, right? The main event is still coming. And because of what the Federal Reserve did in the aftermath of that crisis to make all the problems that caused the crisis worse, it's going to be so much worse when we actually have to deal with the real economic crisis that is still coming. And what's going to really exacerbate it is that the Federal Reserve still doesn't understand its role in causing that problem. To this day, Ben Bernanke, and he's going around promoting his book. Right? He's got a new book out, the Courage to Act. I mean, how much courage does it take to print money? Right? The real title of the book should be A Coward's Way Out. And in fact, when I see it, you see that book, it's in the airport bookstore too. If you see that book on a shelf, move it to the fiction section because that's where it belongs. Right? But he's out there promoting his book like he saved the country. Right? And I talked to him. I ran into him at a conference in Las Vegas where we were both speaking. I spoke for free. He got $250,000 to speak. But anyway, so we're speaking at this investment conference, and I got up. I talked to him at a cocktail party about the crisis, and the guy is still so clueless about the Fed. He thinks that the Federal Reserve's 1% interest rates had nothing to do with the housing bubble. Nothing. It was just a sheer random coincidence that we had a housing bubble and we happen to have these 1% interest rates. Right? Well, it wasn't a coincidence because the minute the Fed lowered interest rates to 1% in 2002, I began warning that this was going to produce a disaster. And by 2004, I knew exactly what the disaster was. And I started writing. I started going around the country talking. I was, going on television, talking about the housing bubble, about how the Federal Reserve had created that bubble, and what the consequences were going to be for the economy when the bubble burst. So I knew about the bubble because I understood the Fed was causing it. The same time that I was out there warning about a bubble, people like Ben Bernanke and Janet Yellen were denying that a housing bubble existed. Even after it burst, these guys were denying. Even Janet Yellen, when Janet Yellen was appointed chairman of the Federal Reserve, right, everybody said she is the brightest one on the Fed because she was the one that was warning about the housing bubble, and nobody listened to her. And, if we only had Janet Yellen at the helm, everything would have been great. I mean, even President Obama said this when he appointed her during the press conference. She warned about the crisis. Right? Well, I actually did a little research on it, and I find out that she didn't warn about anything. In fact, the very speeches where Janet Yellen is credited for having warned, I went back and read those speeches. And not only did she not warn about anything, she actually said that the people who were worried about the housing market were wrong. She said there was no housing bubble, that housing prices reflected the fundamentals, and even as late as 2006, she expected housing prices to keep rising. And she said if she's wrong, if I end up being wrong and housing prices go down, it's not going to hurt the economy. That's how she was, as clueless as you could possibly be. I did a YouTube video, Janet Yellen Exposed. So if you want to, you have some time, you want to watch that video, you can actually, I highlight all the things that she said. She was as clueless as you can be. So now, it's the blind leading the blind, having Janet Yellen. And she was the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco during the entire bubble. Right? I mean, California was, one of the biggest problem areas. California, that area, and Las Vegas. So she was right there and had no idea. So the Federal Reserve is completely clueless about how its very policies caused the 2008 financial crisis. And now they've pursued the same policies on steroids. Right? If you can remember what happened in 2008, right, all the bad things that were supposedly about to happen, that resulted from the Federal Reserve keeping interest rates at 1% for, less than 2 years, a year and a half. And then the Federal Reserve raised interest rates in a measured pace, which was every time they met, they hiked them 1/4 of a point. So it took another year and a half to get interest rates back up to 5%, where they were before the Fed slashed them to 1. And so it was during that 3 years, really, that the biggest part of the damage was done. That's when most of the subprime loans were taken out, the adjustable rate mortgages, the no doc, the interest only. I mean, all this was facilitated by the cheap money that was supplied by the Federal Reserve. And of course, once they got the speculative mania going, it just fed on itself, right? But they lit the sparks with that policy. And we had all this malinvestment that took place because interest rates were too low. Well, if the Fed did all that damage by keeping interest rates at 1% and then raising them back to 5% slowly, imagine the degree of damage that has been done over the last 7 years, where interest rates have been at 0 the entire time. And the Fed has tripled its balance sheet. How much more screwed up is the economy now than it was in 2008, before the crisis? And the crisis is the way the market tries to repair all the problems that the Fed has created, right? Well, there's a lot more problems now. The country is so much more indebted. The structure of the economy is so much more screwed up. And Janet Yellen isn't even talking about raising interest rates back up to normal. Even if the Fed raises interest rates in December, which I still don't think they're going to do, they've been talking about this for a year or two, but even if she raises interest rates from 0 to 0.25, it's still 1/4 of what it was at 1. And she's talking about how even if we raise interest rates to 1/4%, we're going to be really slow before we raise them again. I mean, they may never raise them again.